And good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And we've been involved for a good long time now in a study of the Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24 and Matthew 25. We've covered a lot of territory. Now, I'll be right up front with you. There's a lot of material that I haven't spent a great deal of time on. For instance, I didn't spend an awful lot of time chronicling, corroborating, demonstrating, and proving that every single thing that Jesus mentioned in Matthew 24, verses 4 and following, had come to pass, fulfilled in the first century. You know, the wars, the rumors of wars, the famines, the earthquakes, the pestilence, the famine. I mean, look, folks, we hear people talking today and they point us to what's going on here and there in Libya and Somalia and Syria and what have you. And they say, oh, this has got to be the end times. And they tell us there's never been a time in history like we're seeing today. Well, number one, that's historically inaccurate. Okay. Uh, Folks who make that kind of comment, with all due respect, just simply don't know what they're talking about. They're, we're in many ways, folks, in many ways, we are living, in spite of all the difficulties, in spite of all the injustice, in spite of all the corruption, et cetera, we're still living in the very best of times. So we should never lose track of that. So here we are doing our summary. So I'm not going to go back and I'm not going to chronicle all the wars, rumors of wars, et cetera, that did occur in the first century. I'll just simply make this one very quick observation. Some years ago, I began writing a book on the Olivet Discourse. And when it came to wars and rumors of wars, I began to dig deeply into the history of the Jews, consulting Josephus, for instance, Wars of the Jews, History of the Jews. And I also began to dig deeply into Roman historians. And I discovered that from the period of time when Jesus spoke in Matthew chapter 24 until AD 70, there were no less than, listen to me, no less than 45 major civil wars in the Roman Empire. These are major military conflicts. You know, this this didn't involve just a few hundred people here and there. No. These involved thousands, sometimes multiple thousands of Roman soldiers. So this was an extremely troubling time, even though, nonetheless, in spite of all that, it was still the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. And the reason for that being because the Romans were of such a massive military uh, force that they quelled all of these different conflicts, wars, and what have you, and they put them down fairly quickly. That doesn't negate the fact that there were wars and rumors of wars going on everywhere in the Roman Empire. Doesn't negate the fact that in 69 AD, which is called the year of the four emperors, sometimes called the year of the three emperors, Josephus himself, in chronicling this, said that it appeared that the entire Roman Empire tottered on the brink of destruction. Yeah, that's in the year 69 AD. So, by way of summary, I pardon me, I touched on this 2 weeks ago, and and this is very important. And again, this is summary. But when Jesus spoke about the wars, the rumors of wars, when he spoke about false prophets, et cetera, he said, "Do not be deceived. These are the beginning of the birth pains." What it is important for us to see, and I covered this when I talked about the birth pangs, so this is definitely a summary. Okay? Go back and just do a search of the birth pangs. But I simply want to point this out, by way of summary. In the Jewish narrative, in the Jewish eschatological narrative, there was a timeline of events. There was a list, as it were, of events that the Jews believed would happen in what you and I would call the terminal generation, the last generation. That narrative, that flow line, if you please, included the appearance of of Elijah, foretold by Malachi chapter 4, verse 5 and 6. Elijah would come and settle disputes of the law. During the same period of time as Elijah, you would have what modern terminology calls the Great Tribulation. It is this time that Jesus is talking about in the Olivet Discourse. Wars, rumors of wars, famines, earthquake, famine. The Jews believed that before the final salvation, before the coming of the kingdom, before the coming of the resurrection, before the coming of Messiah in glory and power and in judgment, you had this period of great distress on Israel. This great distress on Israel was to purify Israel, to destroy the rebels, and to leave a righteous remnant for salvation for those who enter into the resurrection, the kingdom, salvation, etc., which would come at the coming of the Lord. Now, why is this important? It is important to realize that Jesus, in his teaching, by the way, the New Testament as a whole follows the Jewish narrative. In my book, The Resurrection of Daniel, chapter 12, verse 2, future or fulfilled, I give passage after passage after passage from the Old Testament, Isaiah 26, Hosea 13, etc., many, many passages, Micah chapter 4, many Old Testament passages that lay out this narrative, that lay out this timeline of the birth pangs. Isaiah chapter 26, O Lord, we have been in pain. We have been in birth pangs, but we have not been able to bring forth and to produce a child. Hosea chapter 13 talks about the distress of Israel before the resurrection. And again, on and on this goes. So it's when I speak of the Jewish narrative, I'm speaking of a timeline and I'm talking about a storyline that the Jews gleaned from the Old Testament itself. They didn't just make it up, okay? It is not a false narrative. And here's what's absolutely remarkable, ladies and gentlemen. And we'll see this as we continue our summary and we come to summarize our teaching on the Great Tribulation, okay? But for now, just keep in mind what the Jewish narrative is. It's the appearance of Elijah. Elijah would come before the great and terrible day of the Lord. Okay? Jesus said John the Baptizer was Elijah. He had come to restore all things. Matthew chapter 17, 10 to 12. So we have Jesus' emphatic teaching that Elijah had come. Look, folks, any Jew understanding the narrative, understanding the things that were to occur in the last days before the resurrection, the coming of the Lord, the judgment, when Jesus started saying, okay, folks, here's what's going to happen. Now remember, he's answering their question concerning the fall of Jerusalem, the end of the age, and his parousia. And he's telling them that before that end of the age, here's what's going to happen. And he warned them, don't be deceived now. All of these things must come to pass, but the end, now to use Luke's terminology in Luke chapter 21, verse 9, all of these things must come to pass first. And by the way, uses the Greek word day, which means it's necessary. These things must happen first. First before what? Before the fall of Jerusalem, the coming of the Lord, judgment, resurrection. But he said, all things must happen first, but the end is not immediately. Greek word eutheos. So what's he saying? He's saying in Matthew, Mark, and in Luke, all of those things, those troublesome things about the wars and rumors of wars, etc., are in fact the end time narrative. And I'm going to make this comment, but again, I'll in my summary on the Great Tribulation that I will do later, I want to bring this to your attention. And again, in my book, Daniel, The Resurrection of Daniel, chapter 12, verse 2, Future or Fulfilled, I chronicle this. I absolutely document it beyond any shadow of a doubt. And by the way, let me make this observation very quickly, running out of time. Most scholars recognize that this Jewish narrative, this Jewish timeline, was in fact the timeline of Jesus and the New Testament. There is no disparity here. There's no conflict here. Jesus was setting forth, agreeing with the Jewish timeline of the last days. So to reiterate what I began to say a moment ago, no Jew familiar with the Jewish narrative of the last days would ever for even one moment think that Jesus was talking about, number one, an end of time. Number two, they would know without any shadow of a doubt that the things that Jesus was talking about were the last days events. And that means since they were to happen in that generation, that meant their generation was the last days generation. The Jews had absolutely no concept of these things continuing to happen for 2,000 years before the end. And so, once again, it is so critical to understand. And in this summary, I'm trying to drive this home, how important it is to understand, number one, what the Jewish narrative was. Number two, that Jesus and the New Testament writers followed that narrative. And point number three, the point that I was getting at, that I said that I will drive home in our summary of the Great Tribulation, is this. In all of the Old Testament passages talking about the end time, the resurrection, they posit that resurrection at the climax of the Great Tribulation. In other words, Great Tribulation leads directly to the resurrection. That means for all of the postmillennialists and all the amillennialists, of which I once was one, who admit that the Great Tribulation was in the first century, that is a tacit admission that the resurrection had to be in the first century. And that means that all prophecy was to be fulfilled in the first century in the events of AD 70. Now look, this month, okay, here we are, September, all right, 2023. I told you I'd have a really good special for you, a couple of books special. Number one, Seal It, Vision and Prophecy. Number two, my brand new book, These Are the Days in Which All Things Must Be Fulfilled. Now, Seal, Vision, and Prophecy is obviously taken from Daniel chapter 9, verse 24. 70 weeks are determined to seal vision and prophecy. Well, to seal vision and prophecy meant the time of the fulfillment of all prophecy, the sealing up of the prophetic office through the fulfillment of all prophecy. So these two books, while Seal, Vision, and Prophecy deals with that chapter 9 of Daniel, All Things Fulfilled is dealing with the Olivet Discourse. Okay? Both passages, Daniel 9, the Olivet Discourse, foretold the time of the fulfillment of all prophecy in the first century in the events of AD 70. Okay, these two books are corroborative with each other. Now, if you purchase the books together, let me make sure my math is correct here. Okay, if you purchase the books separately, it costs you $38.35. All right, but for the month of September 2023, U.S. orders only. Total delivered price is $31.50. But wait a minute, I'm not done here. You're not only going to save $7, I'm also going to give you a free copy of my book, Can God Tell Time? Okay? So you get my brand new book. These are the days when all things must be fulfilled, and seal vision and prophecy, and a free copy of Can God Tell Time? That's a great offer. So that's going to save you close to $10 when all is said and done. Well, it would be over $10 when all is said and done. Okay? Hey, listen, we'll continue our summary of the Olivet Discourse on the flip side. I'll see you there.